Thank you for all those who have joined us today. And let me first welcome my fellow panelists, Stephen Prothero on the left from Boston University, and Zeenat Rahman from the Aspen Institute. Their bios are in there. And my name is Ebrahim Moosa. I'm the co-director of the Contending Modernities program at the University of Notre Dame. My specialty is Islamic studies. In order to kick off the conversation on this topic on religion beyond memes, in part I'm responsible for this particular expression of the problem, religion beyond memes, partly because I thought that the media hides a lot more than what it reveals and clarifies, and particularly through headlines and captions. So in the days of print, when we still read print newspapers, we used to have captions or headlines, and you all remember those headlines that, woman bites dog. Well, it used to be man bites dog, right? But as an equal opportunity kind of activity, I started with woman bites dog. And then you run away with the idea because it's sensational. It just picks up this one idea. It could be a much more complex situation that the individual was caught in a corner, the dog was vicious. In order to save him or herself, they bit the dog, right? So you didn't get the complexity of the story. So I think the way memes function is that complex ideas, symbolic images, a word or an icon like the crucifix, the moon and the star, the word fatwa or the word madrasa conjures all kinds of images. And so a complex history is compressed into this iconic expression, idea, word, image. So the lesson is that whatever is compressed, sometimes it compresses the complexity out of it, the difficulties out of it. And so the lesson is that we need to unpack memes. So for instance, we need to understand that the fatwa is not a death sentence, as most people who read newspapers understood after the Salman Rushdie and Ayatollah Khomeini standoff in the 1980s and 90s, right? A fatwa is, I don't want to do Islam 101, Todd warned us against that, but the idea of fatwa is basically an academic opinion. Now, obviously, it was different that the head of state in Iran issued a verdict that came from an ancient text of how you treat people who show disrespect to the Prophet Muhammad, and therefore it turned into a certain kind of power, and most people thought it was the death sentence imposed on Salman Rushdie, but he basically just quoted what I call the Yellow Pages said, that is this old classical Islamic text. They say certain things and they give certain rules, and those rules do not have to necessarily be cited ad infinitum, but rather they should be interpreted. Or a madrasa is not a place where terrorists are trained. Madrasas are institutions where Muslim theologians are trained, and they are doing scholarly work. Now, of course, some madrasas get involved in forms of radicalism and so on, but that doesn't mean that is the entire story. So the question is that certain memes have become toxic, right? And certain memes can maim people. It can maim entire cultures. It can maim entire societies. And, the word Jew, for instance, in some contexts, does a certain kind of work of discrediting an entire people. So we have to be extremely careful about how we do this work, and so therefore we would like to unpack the memes. And if the memes are not unpacked, what the meme does, it displaces the truth. It displaces the complexity. And therefore, we should not be taking the meme at face value. And lastly, The third point that I want to make on this question of meme is that the meme then substitutes the truth for its own falsehood or its own version of what it thinks is the truth. And I don't want, it propagates something untrue, an untrue version of things. I'm reluctant to use the word that it propagates false news, right? I'm reluctant to use that word, but that's what normally happens, that you put something false into the public sphere. My second set of comments go to, I'm both the moderator, and for those of you who might be wondering why I'm speaking so much, I got 7 minutes to say my say. And the media obsession with, for instance, my second point is that what are we losing with our obsessions in the media? Thinking of this country, of course, at 5 o'clock, a very important person wakes up and tweets to the world. And the rest of the media makes that its daily agenda, right? And it becomes obsessed with that, okay? Now, of course, we have to pay attention to what power does, and that's part of the job of the media, to keep power in check. But if you put all your energy in keeping power in check, what are you missing out? What are the real stories of poverty, of violence, of degradation of schools, of the environment? All those things are lost because all the attention is focused on that. And therefore, I think that the media must watch over power and critique power, but it cannot ask the problems of the rest of society to go on a holiday or go on a sabbatical. And by the time we wake up, those problems will be of a size of a magnitude that we will not be able to address it in a helpful fashion. So, for instance, let me give you 2 examples. I want to hear the media tell me the deeper story of a man in Kentucky whose name is Mr. Jitmood. Mr. Jitmood's son, who was a pizza delivery boy, was killed in the dark of night when he made the delivery. And when the man came to, his son's killer came to court, he's a Muslim man. The slain man's father was Muslim, Mr. Jitmood, and he forgave his son's killer and embraced him. We saw that again in Kansas, where Botham Jean's brother embraced the female policewoman and embraced her. And the judge comes and gives the accused, or now the convicted cop, gives her a Bible and embraces her. I want to know what is going on in parts of the country in terms of religiosity. On the one hand, black religiosity, because the judge is black, African American. I want to know what's going on, what moves Mr. Jitmood? What is the larger story of the humanity that we are seeing there? What are the motives of these peacemakers? Are they peacemakers? Would there be an argument that they are letting the kind of criminals get away? I want to know more about what's happening, and we do know a little bit more because some people write in our op-ed pages in the New York Times about what happened at the Pennsylvania synagogue, where the Muslim religious leadership worked closely with the Jewish community. And as we know, that the synagogue was attacked by the white nationalists because it was engaged in giving sanctuary to refugees. So I think when we get so obsessed with some stories, other stories are neglected, and very important stories that humanize us in a variety of ways. Lastly, is what I want to comment about. I think we need to adopt multiple critique, right? And I think multiple critique is necessary. So the problem might just not be one thing, because it might become reductionist, right? So, for instance, I agree with Todd that the diagnostic of what the problems are, or the issues are, is racism. The issue is race or racism, right, with regard to Muslims. Let's hypothetically agree with that. That the issue is about the color and complexion. Although black Muslims are treated slightly differently. They're not seen as terrorists. African American Muslims in particular, there's a longer history of course, they are subjected to racism. But the Islam, at least since a few decades, is no longer a kind of a questionable Islam, as it was in the days of the Nation of Islam. So the story becomes a little bit more complicated. But the question is, I'm an educator. I'm a writer, I teach, right? How does one deal with people who are racist? You just call them that they are racist? And what kind of conversation are you going to have with them? So I believe the solution, at least one of the ways, is information, education. That's what the media does. At least in its best moments, the media educates, right? And therefore, I think the issue about the diagnostic is that what after the diagnostic? What follows, right? Of course, the burden is on the oppressed. The burden is on the victimized, often, right? We've learned that story. But unfortunately, the lot of me as my lot as a Muslim man who has a family here is not going to change if I'm not going to be an activist. And if I tell the person that you're a racist, it's going to end the conversation, right? Even if that person is a racist, no one wants to hear that they are racist, right? And so I think that the important thing is that we need to possibly take a paragraph out of MLK's lesson, scorebook, where it says darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Now, of course, this is easier said than done. It's about how one transcends some of these difficulties. The Quran, for instance, talks about idfa' billati hiya ahsan. Repel evil with that which is beautiful. And then you will turn your lethal enemy into your bosom friend. But this is a capacity only given to those who have a great deal of self-control and those who have been given endowed with a great fortune. So I think what we need to make people understand, behind every meme is a reality, and a much more complex reality. And we are trying to think here beyond memes of how do we make it possible to articulate that complex reality in a way that is both not only revealing but also transforming. And I think that the important First Lady said at a particular time, when they go low, we go high. With that, I will invite our first speaker, Stephen Prothero, rather the second one. Stephen.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to decide now if I'm supposed to go high or low.
Go both.
Go middle.
But thank you to Keough School and to the Ansari Institute for organizing this event and for inviting me. I am a little fearful I'm going to be a little on the nose because when I get an assignment, I try to be like the good student and pay attention to my marching orders, which I took to be talking about religion beyond memes and how we can make public conversations about religion better, particularly when it comes to academics and to journalists. So that's where I'm going to direct my remarks. I'm not sure what to make of the title of this conference, Religion Beyond Memes, though I take it to betray a certain anxiety. Namely, our public conversations about religion are mired in generalizations and stereotypes. Memes are like quicksand. We religious studies scholars would do well to step around and beyond them. I hadn't given much thought to memes until I was invited to this conference, but in my recent reading on the co-evolution of the human species through biology and culture, this concept, as it has been used for some time by anthropologists and evolutionary theorists, has repeatedly popped up. In this sense, a meme is a piece of cultural information, a phrase, a symbol, a style, a ritual, a performance, an image that competes with other cultural units to be passed down through various cultural activities. Memes succeed not because they are true, but because they are emotionally compelling. One of the intriguing debates among anthropologists about memes is whether the meme is the specific cultural unit or whether that specific thing is an instance of something more general. In other words, whether memes are more concrete or more abstract. When I asked my daughter to explain to me what a meme is, she immediately referred me to the kombucha girl a viral video in which a young woman tries kombucha for the first time and seems to hate it and love it and then hate it and then love it again. When I first saw it, I was reminded of my wife's goddaughter, now 10 years old, who, when we asked about her life on the farm in rural Pennsylvania, said, "I kind of hate it, but I kind of love it." One question anthropologists might ask about this video is whether the meme is the video itself, the specific instance, or whether the meme is something more abstract to which the video is gesturing. Humans have a love-hate relationship with acidic foods, for example, or human ambivalence is inescapable. This matter of the concrete and the abstract bedevils religious studies scholars today, and many, perhaps most, conversations between religious studies scholars and journalists. In fact, it seems to bedevil this conference, or at least the marching orders we got for our short presentations, which steered us toward complexities and away from generalizations. Why this preference for complexity and this anxiety over generalizations? Perhaps appearing to be simple is an anxiety academics have in general. However, I suspect that hard scientists are less anxious on this score. In fact, I can easily imagine a rocket scientist beginning a lecture with some calming words about how the talk to come will not be as complicated as you might imagine. Rocket science is not rocket science, she might say. But we in religious studies seem hell-bent on insisting that the study of religion is rocket science. We want to complexify things, to use a verb that, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, first troubled the English language in the 1830s. Presumably before that, things were more simple. Another anxiety of this conference seems to be that memes are for other people. We academics should take care not to catch them. But there are all sorts of memes that have gone viral among scholars of religion in recent years. There is no Christianity, there are only Christianities. Or, there is no Buddhism, there are only Buddhisms. There is no secularity, there are only secularities. Or a parallel meme, that we must move beyond the world's religions paradigm because Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism and virtually every other religion were not produced and sustained by ancients in India and the Middle East and China. They were the creations of 19th century Western intellectuals. Or a third, that the great error in religious studies scholarship is essentialism. Or one more, binaries are bad, especially the binary between religion and secularity, but not, for some reason, the binary between secularity and post-secularity, which is an acceptable binary. I'm not commenting here on whether these memes are true or false, though I find the notion that it is somehow post-colonial to attribute the founding of the religious traditions of Hindus and Taoists and Buddhists to Max Muller, or the assumption that things need an English noun in order to exist, to be frightfully problematic. My concern is the function of these memes. And my point is that they function to demonstrate our credentials to other scholars. They are designed and employed, in my view, not so much to understand or explain the world or the world's religions, as to ensure our survival and those of our students in the ecosystem of religious studies. They do so by asserting that we are not simpletons, we are not to be fooled. We do not traffic in stereotypes and generalizations and oversimplifications. So we insist on placing scare quotes around even the term religion. We know that this key term, the key term in our field, is a social construction. The world's religions are, to borrow a term from the Buddhist tradition, empty. They have no fixed or unchanging essence. All this is prologue to my effort to answer the best practices question, which begins with the observation that religion reporters operate inside a different ecosystem from academics. They are not anxious about their ability to compete with other scholars of religion or about the standing of religious studies in the academy. More importantly, they are not anxious about engaging in abstraction and compression. They know that every good story needs a combination of the abstract and the concrete, the specific person and the broader milieu. Another meme in religious studies circles is that journalists get things wrong. I have had colleagues tell me that they refuse even to speak to journalists because they don't know what they are talking about when it comes to religion. And even if those journalists did, it would be impossible to compress what they know about a given topic into a soundbite that could be used in an article about, say, the political theater of the Satanic Temple or Tibetan Buddhist views of the Dalai Lama's rebirth. Yesterday, a colleague suggested that a way forward here would be courses on religion at Notre Dame for journalists. The assumption behind this suggestion is that we are the sophisticated ones. I am not so sure about that. Another way forward would be courses at CNN or The Atlantic or Democracy Now! For religious studies scholars on how to communicate complex ideas to the wider public, how to overcome our insularity and kill our darlings, as editors like to say, and speak effectively to broader audiences. Over the last decade or so, I have been increasingly drawn into conversations with editors and journalists, and I must say that I have enjoyed these conversations immensely. Why is that? I think it's in part how my particular brain works. I am by nature or nurture, I am agnostic on that debate, attracted to abstractions more than to specialization. I like to find connections among seemingly disparate things rather than finding discriminations between seemingly similar things. Another reason I've been delighted in conversations with editors and journalists in recent years is that they are expert non-specialists. Even those who have spent years or decades on the religion beat jump repeatedly from subject to subject. Their ecosystem includes editors who need a story and readers who demand strong characters in conflict with one another. They have deadlines they are not allowed to miss, and they have readers who won't abide long series of dependent clauses and qualifications that complexify things. That said, most of the best journalists on religion, especially of the long-form variety, do make things more complex, even as they make them more specific. When it comes to live religion, they beat academics to the starting line, in my view. I've always found it useful to think of journalists as collaborators rather than antagonists. Religion journalists need us to provide context and complexity to their stories, and we need journalists to carry out our work into the wider world. Or to return to the evolutionary metaphor, we are cattle egrets who ride on the backs of cattle, picking parasites off their backs and getting free rides in the process. Or perhaps we are the cattle and they are the egrets. In order to make this symbiotic process work, however, we academics need to be useful. And to be useful, we need to translate our ideas into the idioms of whatever journalistic medium is being employed. Years ago, when I had barely heard of Twitter, I opened an account for the express purpose of doing a world's religion course online, 140 characters per religion. I was working on my survey of the world's religions that was about to appear as God is Not One, and I was getting pushback from scholars who either didn't believe the world's religions existed or who thought it was crazy to try to distill them down to 30 pages apiece. I've always told my students that they can say what they want to say inside all sorts of constraints, in a 15-page paper, in a one-page paper, in a haiku. And I thought it would be fun to try on the constraint of what was then Twitter's 140-word limit. So there's one obvious case of trying to speak in the idiom of the medium employed. Say what you want, but stick to 100 words or fewer, 100 characters or fewer. But similar rules apply when you are on the phone with Emma Green or Daniel Burke, and you know that they are likely to use 0 to 2 quotes from you, and none longer than a sentence or two. Or when you are being interviewed on television, and you know you have no longer than 15 seconds to respond to a question before you will be cut off. Or when you are doing a podcast, and you know that listeners will tune out after a minute or so. Or when you have 10 minutes at a conference and you have already gone over your time. So let me just finish with this point, which is, I think we would do well to think of ourselves as translators. And when it comes to allowing our own ideas to thrive and survive outside academia, and to spread religious literacy and foster the public understanding of religion, it is crucial to think of journalists as our friends and collaborators. In collaborating with them, it is useful to think of our work as a sort of translation, and of that translation not as dumbing down, but as an intellectual challenge, a creative enterprise that needn't slip into stereotypes or oversimplification, but might actually produce new insights and even new, more useful memes. Thank you.
Thank you. Zeenat?
So like Stephen, I'm a good pupil, and so I took very seriously our marching orders of trying to answer the question of what are the challenges in getting religion rights for non-specialist audiences. And like Tariq, who said this morning, he operates on the margins. I too operate on the margins. I'm neither an academic nor a journalist, but find myself in many of those spaces with different sets of actors. So when I look across my experience, I think with painting it with a broad brush, it is around my work has been around how to strengthen civil society. And so whether that's been in the realm of international development, which was to build the capacity of faith-based actors to engage the US government better in international development goals, at the State Department, looking at the intersection of young people, their identity and how they express that in the world. And now I focus more on American civil society, looking at intersections around faith and philanthropy. And I'll say the common theme among all of my different experiences is that religion has always been perceived as marginal to the respective pursuits of the institutions that I've worked for or engaged. Maybe with the exception of international development, I'm looking at Susie Hayward and Catherine Marshall and the very important work that they do in international development. But looking at kind of at the State Department, where economic and political policy and concerns always kind of take the day. There was very little room for engaging actual knowledge around religion. It would turn into lowest common denominator. Just how do we engage faith-based communities? And so I think some of this came from a real prejudice against religion, but I think other times it comes from a really profound lack of knowledge about religion and religious communities. And I think that's just a through line in everything. And I think I've read it in your stuff too, that even people who want to pursue religious degrees or religious courses know very little about religion as they're pursuing them. I have to confess, I had to look up the definition of meme when I got my marching orders for the conference, and think about how do memes show up in my life. And for me, it's as I'm scrolling down my Instagram feed, it comes up. Memes for me are either very funny political things on Twitter or in Instagram in inspirational quotes. And I thought, who do I see the most often? And it's a Muslim philosopher, it turns out, that shows up most of the time in my memes. And do any of you have a guess of who I'm talking about? And irrespective of faith tradition, it's Rumi. So Rumi quotes are like, all the rage on Instagram. Yet that doesn't translate right into the representation of Muslims or Islam in the public square. And the conception of those things don't connect to the communities from which they come from. For some of us heard Dalia Mogahid speak yesterday, and she said, really interesting statistic about the United States, which is that half of all Muslim kids are bullied in schools because of their faith. Also, 2% of news coverage about Muslims actually includes Muslims. And so I often think about how does this kind of public discourse, this abstract notion, connect to actual communities, and what does that mean for those communities that are impacted? Another thing I thought about as I was thinking about this notion of memes is, why are they so popular? Why do and any day you'll scroll down an Instagram feed, and people have these quotes because I think that they are seeking community, personal transformation, expression of creativity, social belonging. We see this is true in the United States among a loneliness epidemic that is showing itself amongst millennials and baby boomers, and in a time of deep polarization. And so Brene Brown has, you will know her writing hopefully, but she writes how the way that we consume media and news, all of that in our echo chambers, only increases our loneliness and our isolation. So how does religion fit into all of that? Because one would say that, in previous times, not in the current time, that religion filled those purposes of social belonging, of community, of personal transformation. And I think the memes are a reflection of what's going on, and what I think collectively we should think about are, what are the things driving us to search for this meaning? So if those are in effect, what are the causal factors, and how does religion speak to that? I won't say an antidote to that. How does religion speak to that? and I want to, offer kind of an interesting anecdote I read about a pastor in the U.S. and he talks about the space that he pastors in, and he says he envisions the space as a community that meets the human needs for connection, spirituality, and physical health, a place where participants strive to live into the fullest expressions of humanity in the bodies that they've been given. And you may think that he's talking about his church, but he's not. He's talking about the CrossFit studio that he bought, and that all of these things show up in those places. So you see this real, like, mingling of the secular and the religious, and how do we make sense of that? Particularly as religion experts, scholars, and then I actually think the media does it better, in terms of being able to tell those stories of why people are on their search for community identity, purpose. What are the causal factors? What are the things that they are seeking? That said, when I think of kind of mainstream media debates around, I guess culture war debates, we think of, did any of you watch the Democratic debates and see the commercial that Ronald Reagan Jr. did? And I just found it shocking, but it was from a secular foundation, and he ends his thing about the separation of church and state by saying, I'm Ronald Reagan, I'm an avowed atheist and not afraid to burn in hell. And it's meant to shock, and it did, right? And so what happens in the news cycle is that then folks on the far right are responding and saying, see, like, that's how Democrats are. But what it ignores is, like, the real lived experience of people of faith, of Americans. Like, those polarities do not represent the way that people express their religion. But they co-opt the conversation. And so I think, if we acknowledge the contradictions that exist in every single one of us about our faith, about what we think of about other people's faith, and that's where we get to complexity in a way. And again, how do we collectively better explore those contradictions? And then I want to just offer some thoughts on community. I mean, so religion is, religar is the Latin for to tie back to, and religion is the ties that bind, which is, tying us to our society currently, past, present, and future. And it has to tie to community. And I think there's a precursor to religious literacy, and I'm sitting with one of the foremost kind of experts on religious literacy. But for us to, I think, as we envision the space of civil society and what does it look like, and it's a changing civil society, that what are the characteristics of engagement, of respectful mutual engagement that acknowledges difference, so not kind of a zero sum, like we're all the same, but acknowledges difference, but still finds common cause and common ground. And so how do we build an empathetic recognition of one another's experience? And I think some of the things that I've noticed and studied through my time in doing this work is that personal literacy is very key to that. It's knowing one's own moral framework and character development, and what does your tradition say about engaging the other, whatever tradition you come from. It's relationship with the other, and I think about what that means. How do we build relationship with the other in a culture we're very much in like a call out culture or in a cancel culture, which is you say one wrong thing and you're out, and that there's a high price to pay for that, and we don't have spaces to be vulnerable with one another, and that, and I think you were saying this about racism. I mean, if you call somebody a racist, they feel that in their bone. You're saying something about them that's deep within them, but not providing necessarily an avenue for productive engagement. So what are the places and spaces that we can think about those questions? 2 minutes? Okay. And then I'll just say, I have some recommendations. All right. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about religious literacy, but I'll save that for the part of the conversation, which is that I think that we need to expand our conception and definition of what we mean by religious literacy. And I think in the U.S. context, that includes a civic education about religion, which is the First Amendment, which is the Establishment Clause. It's just these basic functions and structures that people just do not understand as they're engaging religion and faith communities. in the places that I've been in. And I'll end with a few of the recommendations that I have, which is there's a scholar named Ebrahim Kendi who wrote this book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I recently saw him speak at Aspen. And the moderator was praising him on, that he wrote in a way that was digestible for audiences. And how did he do that, or why did he do that? And he said, I draw a distinction between being a public scholar and public scholarship. And my work is public scholarship, which is urging academics which is writing in a way that's understandable for a broader audience. So I urge you, academics in the audience, to do that, and and to work together with whoever the intended audience is, to make sure that those messages actually land, because I think a lot of the times that they don't. Another interesting thing about his work is How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I haven't read the whole book, but the thesis is that let's focus on the racist policies and the victims of those racist policies, and not so much on the perpetrators. And that gives us, it shows the complexity in the situation. It shows that we're all complicit in a sense, but it doesn't point fingers in a way that then precludes constructive engagement. And yeah, I'll stop there since you're telling me my time's up.
Thank you. Please help with the Thanksgiving. Okay, I picked up the wrong program where the adjusted times.
Yeah.
What time do we end today?
We had
this session?
2:15, another
2:15. Oh, wonderful. So I'm just going to ask one question to pick a fight with Stephen.
That's fair, because I already picked a fight with you.
Yeah, exactly. So, Stephen, your answer to complexity was translation. So I was wondering whether there was a real difference. You're trying to explain complexity in an idiom that a journalist or an audience can understand. Or how is that different from unpacking or decompressing a meme?
I'm not sure it is.
Where's the fundamental difference?
No, I'm not sure it is. I just think that I think what I'm calling into question is the idea that we in academia have the complicated story, and then we somehow have to endure these annoying interactions with journalists who are trying to dumb down a simplified version of what we have. And I just think it's a lot more complicated. I think that all of our knowledge in academia, each of us engages in both specialization and abstraction. But the way the sociology of knowledge works in academia, particularly with the dissertation at the PhD level, is that you are rewarded for knowing more about a topic than anyone else in the world, right? That's how you enter. Whereas if you want to become the religion journalist at CNN or at the Atlantic, you need to know a lot about a lot of different things. And then as you drill down into a particular story, that's where you find the complexity. So I think I just find in a lot of conversations in religious studies, the move is always a kind of it's almost like the turkey, who lives in my backyard, who flares up, their turkey feathers. The way we do that is always through articulating how we can make something more complex. But I think it's equally difficult and equally important to sometimes make things simpler. That there are things we can say that might land really well and really in important ways if we could say them
In accessible ways.
in an accessible and simple way, and that there's nothing shameful about saying a simple thing.
Right. I mean, Stephen, for those of you, there's a big debate in academia, and some of our colleagues are kind of arrogant and snooty. If you write a popular book and they say, oh, well, that's not a smart book that they wrote, and so on. I mean, recently Harold Bloom died, and there were all these obituaries to him. And the man wrote 40 books, but some people in academia felt that the last of his books were basically him just raking out big, contracts of $1 million with major presses. And there was nothing in it. Or the same thing, people talk about the Canadian, what's the name?
Malcolm Gladwell.
Malcolm Gladwell, who's who has occupies an interesting ground between journalism and social science, and I guess he has popularized that. But that might possibly be the attitude of some, and maybe fairly endemic, as you rightly point out. But I think the field is also shifting. So, for instance, I mean, I was a journalist at one stage of my life before I did a master's and a PhD in religious studies. And I can tell you that my understanding, so maybe it was just my impoverished basic education studied in a madrasa and apartheid education, so my impoverished background. But I must say, I mean, once I studied, religious studies, my understanding of religion changed. And if I was equipped in that way as a person who did the religion beat at the Cape Times, my work would have been possibly different, maybe complicated, or possibly unpublishable, some would say. So the issue is obviously to learn, and through experience. I'm not entirely sure where the fundamental difference is, but I agree with you that we need to give. I guess Todd would disagree with you that doesn't matter how much you inform the public, they've got certain attitudes. I believe that we can change their attitudes through education. So I would, yes.
Two fingers to that, which is, I think, a fundamental distinction that I see is that, journalists and media are hyper-focused on knowing who their audience is and communicating to that audience. Academia is to publish scholarship. It's not, and maybe not with an intent, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
We have an audience. I write for someone called Atalia Omer.
Right.
Exactly.
It's a very
it's
narrow
serious stuff,
audience,
right? I mean,
but I don't think academics, write or think or research or any of that necessarily think it's for the scholarship.
Right.
And media and journalists and particularly the rest of the world is very focused on who is the audience. Know your audience. Who is that audience? How are they receiving what you're saying? And there's kind of a disconnect. I think you've done it really well though, because you've done.
And I think with young people now who are coming into religious studies, it's really very different. So there's a, I mean, it used to be even 10 or 15 years ago, it was kind of odd for religious studies scholars to, write for the Washington Post or write for, Slate, which or Salon, which used to be places that people would go online. But now I think it's very common that certainly graduate students in our program, and I think graduate students now in most PhD programs, many of them are writing for Religion Dispatches or killingthebuddha.com or other kinds of places, and so they're seeing their own work as having both in conversation with scholarly experts in the field, and also in conversation with the general public, and I think that's a transformation very much to be applauded.
Right. No, I think that is the trend, and more and more of us want our books to be bought, and wants our people to read us, to have communication, especially with Facebook, Twitter, and others. Zeenat, the question to you was, when you were in State Department and you had to talk to people from different cultural backgrounds and so on, especially when it came to religion and those kinds of issues, did you find the necessity to do some kind of background study? This person I'm meeting, let me figure it out, what this person's cultural horizon, religion would be, if you were not familiar with that?
I mean, I had very little time to do that. Being in a high-profile job at the State Department is that you're drinking water from a fire hose. So in one day I would meet, if I was, let's say, doing a trip to Jerusalem, I would get briefers, or I would do that my own research. But maybe do different 8 to 10 meetings a day with audiences of 50 to 200. So no, I didn't do that always in the places that I was. I think, but my objective was to hear from them and be able to channel concerns that I was hearing from civil society back to the Secretary of State. So I knew that there was like a framework of engagement, but not necessarily like that depth of knowledge.
And that framework is most crucial, right? Because if you don't have that, if you do it differently, then your Secretary of State doesn't understand that.
Right. I mean, what would have been great would have been if at the embassy at Post, there was an officer that could brief me the way that they would on an economic or political issue if they would brief you on
Cultural,
this is a religious landscape, and they don't.
They don't, huh?
That capacity doesn't exist. I think there was a faith-based office stood up under Kerry, headed by Sean Casey. So some of that stuff is getting in slowly. I don't know the state of it now. I think it was maybe decimated a little bit in the new administration. But it's a place that takes a long time to change the culture of.
Okay, let's throw it open for questions.
Could I ask Zeenat one question?
Sure.
I'm curious about, in terms of this issue of translation and knowing your audience, I'm curious about in your career, which has been so like intriguingly varied with
Yeah.
different kinds of work for Interfaith Youth Corps and work for the State Department and work for Aspen. Those seem to be such different places. Could you just talk a little bit about the ways that you talked about religion or about religious difference or religious similarity that might have worked in one context but didn't work in another context, and sort of how you saw yourself speaking different languages?
So I think when I worked at the Interfaith Youth Corps, which is an NGO in Chicago that brings young people of different faith backgrounds together, it was more than 10 years ago. And so the starting point was that, you know, there is a problem between people of different religion. Like, you'd have to convince people of the problem, or that Islamophobia is a problem, or that you no longer have to do that. So that's just huge. You're not spending your energy on diagnosing the problem. And as an NGO, you always have to do that in order to be effective. I think people say, yeah, we get it. Let's adopt, you know, what are the solutions? What are the interventions that we can consider? The State Department role was not faith focused, which was interesting. And so it was very focused on this, like, my job was youth engagement, and it was very focused on hard skills, right? So how do you build the economic prosperity for young people around the world, focus on entrepreneurship and the things that the White House was really plugged in on and keyed in on. And I think when I would speak to young people around the world, they didn't lead with their faith, and they resented the fact that the U.S. saw them that way, particularly talking about Muslim majority country, young people from Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, right? That's not how people in different parts of the world necessarily understand their faith, but yet that they would feel like that was the primary lens by which the U.S. saw them, and that was destructive to, and that would prohibit constructive engagement. Also, you know, all of our foreign policy choices are what informed that conversation, and so they would come in with baggage. Now, as I work with many philanthropies, kind of advising them on how to do religious engagement better here, it's really trying to understand that role of faith in civil society. What is a pro-social role that faith communities can play in having a strong civil society and being critical to social cohesion and the things like the other impacts that we're trying to see in our broken communities. And so it's like a Rubik's Cube. It's always turning the language different, but really, as I started saying, like it's never a primary goal of anywhere that I've worked. So it's always figuring out how does this relate to the primary goals that this audience is looking to advance.
Question. Please, there's someone at the back. Just please raise your hands and just briefly introduce yourself. I know lunch is working its way through, chicken sandwiches and stuff, but there's a lot of coffee outside, and we want you stimulated.
So my name is Mark Sullivan. I think I may think similarly to Professor Prothero, maybe because of my educational training, but I try to find similarities over differences. And very briefly, I want to share a few points that all of the authors, professors made on stage, starting with Professor Moosa, when he said, why put all your energy or power in keeping power in check? How does one deal with people who are racist? Maybe ask why they're racist. And then he quoted what I think is some impactful scripture, repel evil with that which is beautiful. And he said, the people who are able to do this successfully have the capacity to have a great deal of self-control and a fortune to be able to do so. And then Professor Prothero talked about memes, and he described memes as quicksand or maybe a piece of cultural information, and then asked, what is the function of a meme? And he said, is it to ensure survival, to certify that people from certain groups are not fools, or maybe I would suggest to demonstrate that that individual has some capacity for a higher order of thinking. And then he used the term symbiotic process, which some people that I shared lunch with said, may mean we are all in this together. And then finally, Professor Rahman, shared the thought of the real living experience of Americans with faith. And I guess I share all these points, which to some may seem disjointed, but I find similarities or themes in all of these to say, maybe culminating in what Professor Rahman is arguing for, what is the real living experience of Americans with faith? And why do we feel that we live in a community, a country, a world where we can't have that faith? And then finally, maybe to conclude, one of our audience members in the front projected, what if we live in a world perhaps where there's a degradation of that faith? So I know those are a lot of thoughts that may seem disjointed to me. They're similar, and I was hoping perhaps in some small way you could bring those together.
Well, I can address the last point you made, or the theme running through about the degradation of faith, and I'll address it as a historian, which is to American religion, which is to say that this is a very old idea. This is the declension idea that comes in the 17th century in New England, before the Puritans have barely, built their outhouses yet. They already have a sense that God had favored their project, and now their project was going under because faith was so under attack. And I think that there's just been a long conversation in American history about, is faith under attack? Do we have too much faith? Do we have too little faith? And in some ways, that's just one of the great conversations in American culture. And I think right now we have more of a pendulum swing, particularly on the religious right, to the idea that somehow faith is under attack. I think that there's a tendency of all of us, when things change, to imagine that we are somehow being attacked. It's a very natural human situation. But if you go from a situation where your group is favored to a situation where no group is favored, that's perceived as a diminution. And if you go from a situation where no group is favored to your group being favored, then you have a sense of being favored over against the others. So I don't know. I guess I would bring some skepticism to the idea that we live in a society where faith is under attack. It seems to me we live in a society that has so much religion in the public space as to be excessive. So I guess I would just place that in the context of that longstanding debate.
I would just maybe add on to that to say that we have so much of one religion in the public space, right? And that's the majority religion. And so, but we don't, people of minority faiths don't see themselves represented in the discourse around, in the narrative of religion in this country. So it went from kind of Christian to Judeo-Christian, and those conceptions have always expanded to include those things, but doesn't include other people of faith. So when people of minority faiths who might be brown or black try to fit into that meta narrative, they don't fit in, right? And it's an otherizing.
Even your example of Rumi is a good example there, right? That he is not really perceived
As Muslim.
You described him as a Muslim philosopher, but he's just a poet,
Right.
right? And that's part of why he's the #1 or #2 best-selling poet in the U.S. alongside Oliver, depending on the year.
Right.
And part of that is that he's just this generic, cool, smart guy who wandered around and maybe
Right.
had a male lover.
Maybe he didn't have too much melanin in his skin.
Yeah.
But it's, what does a new civil religious narrative look like? And we're building that as we go, and nobody's doing it well. And there aren't spaces to really have that conversation. I look at, as I was thinking of memes, I was also thinking of pop culture and how, from my perspective as a Muslim, right, there's so many more representations in pop culture of Muslims self-representations. And there were, 5, 10, 15 years ago, and I'm thinking of Rami Youssef, I'm thinking about, the stand-up we saw yesterday, or, and the comedians, and all these different expressions of identity which complicate the picture and which are necessary, I think, to complicate the picture. And let's pay attention to all of those as manifestations of lived faith.
And even the hotel that we stayed in has Muhammad Ali. It
Right.
has Sophia. Who's the other person? I can't remember, but it has Muhammad Ali there out in front. And he's another person who is a Muslim who we don't necessarily register. I mean, for a good part of my youth, he was the most recognized human being
Yep.
on the planet.
Yeah.
And he was reviled for a time for his politics and for his affiliation with the Nation of Islam. But by the time I was a teenager, he was just this cool boxer guy. And so there's another example of where, in terms of memes, the way we don't read that as like cool Muslim guy, right? We should all be like him. We just read it as, boxer, tough guy, whatever, smart, the greatest, whatever it might be.
Some time ago, Freddie Mercury, who made a comeback with a movie, in the lyrics of the song Bohemian Rhapsody, most people didn't know. He quotes the word Bismillah, right? Bismillah means in the name of God. It's the first, opening line of every verse of the Quran except one. So it was there. I don't know how many people related that to that. Are there any questions? I mean, we can go on here if anybody would like to have yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask Zeenat, Rahman, if as an expert in youth, can you tell us a little bit about the demographics of memes and how they're used very differently by older folks and by younger folks, and even among youth? I think of my own children. My youngest is 11, and she constantly, the others always say about her that she speaks in memes, she thinks in memes, and they are 12 and 15, and they say she's a different generation from them. And that versus, kind of your grandfather's use of memes.
Right. Yeah, no, so I'm quick to admit what I do not know, and I'm not an expert in youth that can answer that question, but I turn it back to maybe Heidi has a response to that. Sorry, Heidi. Or anybody else in the audience that would know, because I don't. I would just be anecdotal. Yeah, you.
I think that younger generation.
Can I just say something while we're waiting for Heidi to get the mic? So we're working on a new course at Boston University on the world's religions, and we want to have a digital component in each section. And so I was saying to my colleague, Margarita Giori, we need to do this. How should we do it? And she said, oh, well, Heidi Campbell, we just need to assign her book. We need to get her resources in our course. So that's Heidi Campbell there. She needs to answer the question.
It's going to be a course in memetics.
So I think
Heidi, yes.
I think when your daughter, they're saying that that your younger daughter is a different generation is probably true, because how young people see authority, especially religious authority, has shifted a lot in the last 10 years, and has a lot to do with kind of understanding that it's your peers that are the authorities and the gatekeepers, rather than kind of religious authorities. And young people nowadays, when they get exposed to religion, it's either in the home, but most likely it'll be through Rabbi or Imam Google, not from face-to-face contact with the religious community. So there's a real shift in kind of these media influencers and their peers being part of that kind of authority process. And so we see kind of the memes taking on a different kind of role and kind of like expressing their ideologies.
And do young people have the sense, are there like religious influencers, or are there just the influencers who might say something about religion? Like, do they have a sense of specialists that they would go to?
They would go through, basically, it's how do you present your religious identity. So, in some places, it's kind of like the certain kind of bloggers, like Rachel Held Evans has become an icon for especially young women that are kind of moving out of evangelical kind of discourses, as well as kind of people like, I can't think of different celebrities' names, but that kind of profess certain kind of religious beliefs. And they become kind of the spokespersons, again, like of how do you live out that religious identity, more so than kind of what you learn in catechism or what you would learn like in a Sunday school context.
This is hugely prevalent in the Muslim American community probably because we're flatter, less hierarchical than other communities. But a lot of the young Muslim scholars who speak to those audiences, they have huge followings.
Total Twitter, Facebook, and also people who subscribe to their television
Right,
channels and stuff.
right.
So with that, our time is up. Please help me to thank Stephen Prothero. Thank you very much.